Guys, and we're ready to do the May blocks, and this month they are piecing in the hoop, so they're not embroidered like we have been doing. And you will need to make 2 of them. I've already made 1, so let's get started. Okay, now what you're gonna need, we're still using the poly mesh stabilizer. Each block is done kind of in 2 sections. You'll do the piecing it together in the hoop, and then you'll sew those 2 units together, and then the quilting is done after it's pieced together. So you're gonna need 3 or 4 hoopings for your 5x7 hoop. I'm also using the 6x6 hoop to do my quilting. And then as far as what's in your kit, you're gonna have 8 pieces of each of these fabrics. And then your prep work, you are gonna need to iron some of the SF101 just on the back of the white with the little yellow bees. And then you're gonna need 2 4x4 pieces of your project batting, your scissors, and then I'm going to show, if you haven't done the piecing in the hoop, we use the little fabric folding pins, and I'll show you how these work. Okay, so we're just going to go into the May folder and then into the embroidery files, and there's just 1 file that we need to bring up, and again it will fit in your 5x7 hoop, and then we'll send that to the embroidery screen. Recommends in the instructions to use kind of a neutral color thread for the piecing, but I'm going to go ahead and use kind of a pink color so you can hopefully see my stitches in the camera. And again, the block is done in 2 sections. So we're going to do the piecing for this bottom section first, and then this one, and then you sew those 2 units together. So what it's going to stitch off first is just a template for the bottom section. Okay, and then what we're supposed to do is lay your fabric down right side up. The first piece is always right side up. I've done up, years ago when we first started doing piecing in the hoop, I did up this little handout that says kind of the steps for the piecing. And so for step number 1 is lay the first piece right side up. And in your pictures, in your instructions, you can kind of tell the area that this fabric needs to lay on. And so again, we're doing this section right here, and so the first piece is going to be laying over this first little quadrant right up in here, and you just lay it right side up. And your pieces are definitely oversized, so you just want to cover up that whole section. And then what you're stitching is the trim line. And then you can see in that picture on step 2, you're going to be trimming this bottom part away. So we're going to trim that. And then your next piece is going to lay right side down on top of that. And you want to cover up, you want to center that piece on that trim line, and I like to cover up the bottom piece of fabric and then what it's going to sew. So this is right side down, so you have right side to right side, and so this is going to be your seam line. And then step 6 is to press that with your pen. So what that means is we're just going to take this fabric, it's a little starch solution, and you just kind of squeeze it, and it just lays, you kind of distributes that on the seam line, and then you flip that over and kind of press it down. And then what's going to stitch next is going to be the trim line again for our next piece. Okay, and so now we need to trim this fabric away. And we're going to be trimming both of these. Then we're going to take the next piece of fabric, which is the peach fabric, and it doesn't really have a right or a wrong side, but you want to center it over that. Oh, I cut a hole in my stabilizer. That's okay. Center it over that trim line and cover up the fabric, bottom layers, and then stitch the seam line. And then we're going to press that with our fabric folding pin, or just distribute the solution, and then you flip this over. And now we're going back, so your fabric is just going to rotate. So it's the darker peach color, the white, the light peach color, but I'm getting ahead of myself. We need to stitch the trim line. And then the next piece of fabric that we lay down is going to be the darker peach fabric again. So we're going to trim this away. And I'm trying to do this, I'm filming this by myself and the camera's on the tripod, so I'm trying not to take the hoop off the machine. Then you're going to lay your next piece down. Again, it's going to be the darker peach color. Make sure it's centered on that trim line and cover up all of that. And then sew that seam. Press that with the folding pin and then flip that over, and then now it's going to sew the trim line again. And now here the trim line just stitched right here, but we have all of this fabric we need to trim, so I just kind of start down here and start trimming kind of even, and then trim that away. And then our next piece that we're going to lay down is the white. It's going to go right side down, center it over the trim line, cover up the fabric, and stitch the seam. Do the fabric folding pin, press that over, flip it over, and then the next thing that's going to stitch is going to be the trim line again. Now, what we need to trim away is this part up here. I'll take the hoop off. And we're going to trim it like this. There we go. It's not neat when you trim it. And then you need to lay the peach fabric down, like peach. And again, this one doesn't have a right or a wrong side, so we're just going to cover all that up, center it, and stitch the seam line. rolling pin, flip it over. Now the next thing it stitches, or the last thing on this section, is going to be kind of a trim line. And so it's just going to go all the way around the perimeter of the little piece. Now, what it's going to do next is the next section up here, but we do need to kind of trim this piece away so it's not in our way. And what it's going to stitch is, again, the kind of pattern or the template . Okay, now I'm going to try to show you the block here. We just did this block, or this section down here, so the bottom section. So this is the next section that we're doing. So we're on page 4 of your instructions on step 13 and 14. And so we're going to lay the first piece of fabric that we're laying down is going to be over this. And again, it's going to be right side up. This is the first piece. So it goes right side up, cover up that whole area, and then it's going to stitch the trim line. Okay, we're going to be trimming this section up here away. Okay, taking the hoop off so I can trim this section here. All right, and put the hoop back on. And the next piece, we're going to lay the white piece, make sure it's right side down, center it over that trim line, and it's going to stitch the seam. And see how that shifted when it started stitching and it's not straight? It's okay. We're going to press that or use our starch pin, flip that over, and then it's going to sew the next trim line. Okay, we've got to trim this part up here at the top. Oh. So I'm taking the hoop off so I can get to it and trim that section. The next piece we lay down is going to be one of the light peach colors. Again, it doesn't have a right or wrong side, but just make sure you're centering it on that trim line. And then sew the seam. Alright, do that. Okay, flip that over. We are now on step 19, no, on step 18 of your instructions. They're on page 4. And now it's going to stitch the trim line again. We need to trim this away here. Then our next piece that we lay down, again, it's rotating around, so the dark peach, the white, and then the light peach. So it's going to be the dark peach, right side down, center it, sew the seam line, fabric folding pin, flip it over. We call this either the fabric folding pin or a starch pin. Call it both things. Now it's going to stitch that trim line. This piece is what we need to trim away. So rotate that around. And we need to trim all of this off here. So I'm just going to go straight. And it's the last white piece, well, my last white piece, because I've already done one block. Lay that down, right side down, cover up the fabric, make sure it's centered on that trim line. Sew the seam. Use the fabric folding pin, flip it over, press it, and then stitch the trim line. Sorry, that thread bugging me. Okay, now I need to trim this away here. So I'm gonna slide the hoop off, turn it, I'm trimming this part. Then we're going to lay the peach fabric down. This is my last peach fabric. Lay it down, center it, sew the seam. Press that, flip it over, and then last thing it's going to do is stitch that outline border all the way around. And it's done. And so we're gonna take it out of the hoop, and on page 5 of your instructions it says we're gonna trim these 2 sections down so that they are 2.5 by 4.5. Okay, so once we unhoop it, then get the hoop out of the way, you can turn it over and trim it from this side, and you're just gonna, follow that outside line, or you can trim it from this side, but use your ruler, don't just eyeball it. You wanna make sure these pieces are exactly the 2.5 by 4.5. So we're gonna go trim these down. Okay, so once you have them trimmed down, then you want them positioned like this to make the little pinwheel. We're gonna put them right sides together, and then on your regular sewing machine, we're gonna stitch these together with a 1/4 inch seam. What I did is I just kind of folded this one down and made sure that the center seam was lined up on both sides. And then you wanna sew, even though to me, I think this is a little bit more than a 1/4 inch. You want to stitch on that placement line right there. Hope you can see it in the camera. But you're just going to stitch all the way down on that placement line. And then that makes your points line up exactly. So I will get that done, and then we will quilt it. And then when you open it up, your points match exactly. Okay, so what I've done after I pieced those 2 units together, I pressed the seam open, and then I've sprayed the back of it and the back of my piece of batting with the 505 spray. And then again, to do the quilting, you probably want to use your candle wick, the off-white color thread. I'm going to do the first part of it in the pink so you can see the placement lines in my hoop. So I've hooped up another piece of poly mesh. We're going to go into the background quilting folder, and we're going to go get the block by block again, and we want the 4x4 quilting design. Now again, you could do both of these. You could do 2 of them in one hooping and like the 6x10 hoop if you wanted to. Now, what it's going to stitch off first is going to be the placement line for our batting. And this is basically the same steps, it's just our block is going to fit exactly. Instead of our background pieces have usually been oversized, our block is going to fit exactly in the placement line for our fabric. Now, we don't need the tack down for the batting, so we're going to come back over here and we're going to go down through that tack down, and then what it's going to stitch off next is the placement line for our fabric. Okay, and then we're going to lay our piece of batting right down inside that placement line for the batting. And remember, it has the 505 spray on the back of it. And then we're going to lay our block down inside the fabric placement line. And it's going to fit exactly inside that placement line, or it should. And you can kind of stretch it and pull it and make it fit. And again, it has the 505 spray on the back of it, so that's going to stick it down. So we don't need to stitch off the fabric tack down because it's going to go right along the edge here. So we're going to come back over here and we're going to forward down through that, and then that just takes us directly into the quilting. And now, before I started stitching, I did go ahead and rethread to that off-white candle wicking thread to do the quilting design. Okay, and it's done doing the quilting, so all we need to do is unhoop it, and then unhoop it, and then you'll just trim the poly mesh down right to the outside of it. Use your regular ruler and make sure this is measuring exactly 4.5. And if you have to trim like some of the poly mesh within that 4.5 inches, you can do that so that when we sew this all together, we'll have that accurate seam allowance. And remember, you'll have both blocks that are pieced in the hoop. I wanted to show what was in the background of our work area today. I'm working on the samples for the next Kimberbell event. It's called Hello Pumpkin. And so it's going to be doing the little, what they call frame screen design, and the little jar wrap. And then we have the little stuffy, acorn stuffies. And then I'm also doing the samples for the bonus CD. So I've got the Christmas one and kind of the spring and the summer one done, and then I've still got to do the Valentine's Day one out of this fabric right here. There's a picture of the bonus CD. So it is pretty cute. So just wanted to show y'all that.